last couple of years working on responses to the Airports Commission. You've heard of the Airports Commission? So Howard Davis? Yeah, everyone wants to extend either Heathrow or Gatwick Airport. We thought slightly differently and said that there needs to be a real need to bolster airports out in the regions, and fortunately Sir Howard has recognised that. So that's a lot of what I've been doing, but behind the scenes I've also been working to maintain our crisis management preparedness. And I've done that for a number of organisations that you know quite well, Virgin for example, and done it with a fair degree of success. So what you're going to hear this morning from me is what has worked for me. I've labelled it theory and practice. I'm going to talk through the theory insofar as it's worked for me. It's not one size fits all, and I think that as you develop into your careers and get involved with crisis management, you'll realise that the world is changing very, very rapidly, and what some guy in the lecture theatre told you several months ago may be absolutely irrelevant, or you may actually want to change it and adapt it to meet your needs. So going through the theory, I just want to talk through 10 steps for crisis communications to start with, and then perhaps go on to something a little bit more interesting to talk about some of the day-to-day things that I got involved with and how some of the theory can be applied into practice. Now, it's very obvious to say anticipate crises, but actually that's not always that easy to do. There are a number of steps here, and I'm going to talk you through those. So let's talk about anticipation. And the first thing to do is to start off without any preconceptions, to start off with a blank sheet of paper, and quite often with people that don't know the industry that you're working in. Because if you do that, you'll start getting people asking the questions that might seem stupid to those that are in the industry, might seem a bit daft, and get people to really ask off-the-wall questions. And you do that in a very unthreatening environment so that people can really say what they feel. And if they don't know how something works or process works, they feel that they can ask about that process. One of the first things that I've always asked is, can some of the situations that we face be changed using existing methods, avoided by using existing methods of operation and changing them. And quite often, organisations set up their own little man traps, bear traps for themselves. They don't realise that they're walking into a very deep, dark forest. They don't know quite where the comms activity is going to end. And that's the point that I'll trip themselves up, or you'll find one of your critics is there to trip you up as well. What's the best and worst case scenario? Depending on the industry that you work in, the worst case scenario might be loss of shareholder value, as something really daft gets said that undermines your brand. In an airline, or an airport, or a transport operator, of course the worst case scenario is something goes catastrophically wrong and you end up killing a lot of people, and that's a completely different ballgame. And then there's the home goal. Are you actually planning to create a crisis yourself? And organisations that I've worked with in the past seem to think that downsizing, restructuring, and the redundancies that get made as a result will just kind of happen and no one will take any notice. Well, believe me, even if it's not a national story, anything that involves loss of jobs these days is something that is a local issue for local media, and you've got to be prepared for it. And these things can rapidly spin out of control. As I said when I started this, it's very important to make sure that you get outsiders, people outside your little clique or your level of expertise, to come and ask those questions that may not even seem obvious to you, to critique what you've got, so you don't just get into your own narrowly confined box that's just about corporate communications. And if you do that, involve other teams in the process, it will actually help you later on, and I'll touch upon that a little bit later. So who is your crisis communications team? Very, very clearly, you need a figurehead, you need your chief executive, and you need your senior management involved. Quite often, though, you have to be very, very clear that your chief executive is trained and is the appropriate person to speak in any given situation. So, for example, you might have a very technical, very specialist issue and an interview in the crisis situation that's being done by a technical journal or someone with enhanced technical knowledge. In that case, it might be absolutely correct for the operations director to lead that part of the crisis management. So always bear in mind that it's not just about the figurehead for the company, it's about people that can give detailed, reasoned responses, so you don't seem to be glib, you don't seem to be just a very thin veneer on top of everything. Day-to-day communications team, that's incredibly important, because you have your day-to-day public affairs people, you have your press office, you have people that are employed to communicate, either to the media, to stakeholders, or indeed to local communities in the case of Birmingham Airport. But you have to also be sure that you have people that can help you when you have a crisis, because you're never going to have enough people. So what I did was I made sure that team organisers, chief executive, secretary, and people that could actually drop what they were doing in a crisis and come and help, that they became part of a volunteer team that were trained in the art of really passing on quite elementary messages, running, making sure that, for example, members of the press were shown to wherever the press conference was taking part, and that took the pressure off the professional team who could make sure that the key important messages were put across. How does your organisation relate to others? In the case of an airport really is a big bus station. You park planes there and there are shops there. What that means is there are a lot of other organisations on site. In the case of Birmingham Airport, where I was last, that's 140 organisations, 5,000 to 6,000 people, many of whom probably don't have or didn't have crisis communication plans. So you need to make sure that if something does go adrift with one of those organisations and it's sitting on your property, that you know about it pretty quickly. And that's particularly important when you have issues such as industrial relations, which I mentioned earlier. You can get to a situation where you end up with a shop, and I won't name it, a retail outlet, and all the staff go on strike. The first thing you hear about it is when your press office gets phoned up to say, I hear you've got a lot of staff on strike. So you find that you actually start acting vicariously for others, and it is your reputation and your brand that gets touched by it. Because people see an airport and consider that that is your airport and you're responsible for everything that takes place on it. Safety issues, yes you are, but in terms of messages and communication, it does become quite challenging and problematic. And you really have to make sure that the senior people in those organisations buy into the idea of putting together a crisis communications plan. It's all right to identify a team. It is then incredibly important to make sure that you identify and train those people that are going to speak. And it's a case of clarity to make sure that when there are messages, safety critical messages put across, they're put across in an unambiguous way, and that the tricks of the trade when being interviewed by the media are such that you can finish what you're going to say and not be diverted onto another particular tactic that the media might be trying to play on that particular day. It's also very important to recognise that if you have a major incident, I'll show you towards the end of this, one of the incidents I had at the airport, that you, or one of your trained people, might not be the first on site. I've worked in the rail industry, and I've been on first on site in cases, one or two cases where there have been serious incidents. But I've also attended incidents where the first person on site was actually a relatively junior member of the organisation who happened to be on call on that evening and got the phone call and used their initiative to go out to site to make sure that they could control, as far as they could, the media on that site. So it's very useful to make sure your top team is trained, but never go down a line where you're so thinly spread that you only train the people at the top, because everyone must be an advocate for your organisation when you have a crisis. I mentioned earlier suitability. Most organisations have a personality. They have a person in that organisation that is either a little bit of an anarchist or a little bit subvertive. And if you look at the example of Ryanair with O'Leary, he was a great CEO because he got across those qualities, and a lot of people liked him. A lot of people didn't like him very much. He was a Marmite character. But he had those qualities, and they worked in that instance. But that is probably not the kind of attribute that you want to put forward if you had a serious crisis involving loss of life. So think very, very carefully about the suitability of individuals throughout the organisation for who might be best to talk when there is something that is particularly onerous or more serious. I mentioned earlier technical knowledge. Make sure that the person that is speaking on behalf of the organisation isn't just equipped with sound bites, but does understand at least a little about the organisation's operation and the way it does business. And make sure that you always have someone to hand at the end of a telephone that can give advice on technical issues. Again, making sure that you have a little black book with key contacts that can be called 24/7. Processes and the monitoring systems. When I first started, it sounds like a right old fart now, aren't I? But when I first started, the only communication that we had was fax machines and landlines. And mobile phones were just coming to the front. But in the rail industry, the kind of places that we had incidents tended to be cuttings or tunnels or out in the countryside, so mobile phones didn't work. That actually worked in our favour because it meant that control and developing a crisis response was a lot easier than it is today. Because today, if you have a major incident, you can pretty much bet that before you and your organisation has heard about it, it's up there on social media. So you do have to be very, very aware it's instantaneous communication now. You cannot keep the genie in the bottle. One of the things that you need to look at when you consider your crisis plan, your processes, is where are you going to put people who can make key decisions about your organisation and how you deal with the crisis. I call that the war room. Remember that I said that at the airport I worked at, we had 140 companies on site. Well, that's just the companies. We then have the control authorities, security services, the police, the ambulance, fire service, 2 fire services actually. The airport had its own, then the external one. Before you know it, you actually have representatives from a lot of organisations. So you need to make sure that you have somewhere where the key people from those organisations can sit and can manage the process. And that is quite often somewhere that's off-site, because you will not necessarily find somewhere on your site where that can be done. You also need to be acutely aware, depending on the industry you're in, that the crisis itself might affect the site that you're on. So you may find that you don't have access to the emergency rooms, the war room that you've created. So always have a backup, always plan on doing something that's off-site as well as on-site. So that's your war room. The next thing to think about is a media room. And one thing you can be certain of is that members of the press that want to attend an incident will actually want to scratch around and have a look and interview people that are right in the front line. They will not necessarily want to be corralled in one position that's sometimes quite distant from where the incident is taking place. So what I've done in the past is make sure that you can identify a media room. Those runners that I mentioned earlier become absolutely critical in making sure they can round people up as they're wandering around a site trying to get a story. And what you need to do is make sure that you feed the media with information. So you have to schedule, after a crisis has occurred, regular meetings and briefings, probably every hour. What you have to do, though, is make sure that you have a black book that codifies all your processes. So as soon as an incident happens, for example, who do you call? As soon as an incident happens, who goes where? Who do you tell about the incident? And it's quite often useful to have a set of cue cards for yourself and your team to tell them who to call and where to go. And in terms of who to call, and where to go, and who to inform, there are a lot of people that have a stake in your organisations. It will never be the same group of stakeholders, I would suggest. And depending on where you work and what your particular role is, the stakeholders in your business will be quite varied. You have internal stakeholders, as I mentioned earlier, retail outlets at the airport, as well as the emergency services. You have partner organisations that perhaps serve the airport, buses, taxis, railway companies. You have trade organisations that recognise and represent, for example, all of the airports in the United Kingdom. And you want to make sure that you can draw upon their resources if you've got an issue that's common for a number of airports. If you draw on trade associations' resources, they can often speak in general terms on your behalf and take some of the pressure off. Other stakeholders, as I mentioned earlier, include all of your employees. Sometimes the most junior people in an organisation can be the most useful in a crisis. And making sure that other people, media perhaps, are pointed in the right direction and are treated in a courteous manner. Relatives, perhaps, if someone's been injured, are shown to a reception suite where they can be kept away from the media and given the latest news on any incident that's taken place. Obviously, directors of the organisation, and my organisation had directors as far afield as Australia and in Canada, meaning there are different time zones. Always great to wake directors up in the middle of the night, I have to say. And then local community, because if you've had something that's very visible on site, you want to make sure that local councillors, MPs, and people that are likely to show interest know what's going on. There's nothing worse than living next to a large airport, hearing a big bang and crunch, and thinking, I wonder what that was. Statutory authority is obviously, if there's been an incident, depending on what business you work in, you do have accidents that are notifiable. So, for example, the aviation authority will get involved in regulatory issues affecting airports, and then the Air Accident Investigation Branch would come and have a look at bits and pieces on the ground to try and establish the cause of any incident. And I think over the last 12 months, we've seen the kind of work that those organisations do across the world. So the first thing to do is obviously not to panic, but when an incident has taken place, make sure that actually you have a holding statement put out. And developing your holding statement well in advance will actually pay you dividends. And they don't have to say very much. They acknowledge that you've had an incident, that a crisis is underway. You fill in the gaps. If you look on the right-hand side of the screen, for example, 10 o'clock this morning, an incident occurred, there will be a flight from, fill the gap in here. What I'll show you later was Amsterdam. And we'll be supplying additional information when it's available. If you get that out on social media, get that out to the press, get it out to your stakeholders, they know that you're on the case. And what is likely to happen is that they will come back to you for further information before starting to go to other people and trying to get a different angle on it. Always review your holding statements once you've issued them. Keep the point and don't waffle. This isn't a grandiose lecture on paper about your quality of English. It's about keeping the point, giving people their facts. As I say, things have changed. It's not just about distributing on paper. Though that is important if there are media on site. And again, it's another job for your runners. Photocopying, giving out a piece of paper. Make sure that you use social media to get the message across. The other thing I'm very, very keen on ensuring is that there are regular exercises for crisis. And depending on the organisation that you're in, I've been in the rail industry where they have a lot of desktop exercises. Are you familiar with the term desktop exercise? So you sit around a table with a number of cards being given out from time to time by somebody that puts you into a hypothetical situation. You don't actually go out on the ground and rehearse what has really happened. That's great up to a point, but there's also what I call a real exercise. And that is a major event, and it's an event, for example, I've managed a number of these, where perhaps on a Sunday morning, we involve the emergency services, other authorities in a hypothetical situation, and some of it might involve security, some of it might involve an incident, plane crash, and you rehearse what you would do. And that is actually a very time-consuming operation to plan, because not only do you have to have the emergency services there, You need volunteer wounded, you need volunteer relatives to play the part, and you need to make sure that you learn lessons. The challenge with real time or real exercises is making sure it's not all written to one big script so everyone's just acting out of play. Because if you do that and everyone acts to a script, there's no point doing it. So what I've always done, as far as I possibly can, is kept the scenario absolutely secret until launch. So only the key people know that scenario, what the full scenario is. So for example, emergency services would have agreed to an exercise and undertaking that exercise within a certain time band, because obviously we have to make resources available. And they will know the nature of the incident, so whether it's a terrorism incident or maybe a fire or something similar. But apart from that, it's really important to make sure no one knows anything else, because otherwise they'll just reverse the responses. One of the exercises that I did manage early on, and one of the reasons that I learned from this, was that our operations team were really just going through the motions. It was about the planes and landing and damaged itself quite severely as it landed. So I started to throw a few extra things in my team here. We started inventing hypothetical situations that weren't in the script. So, for example, in the war room, the person that was managing that war room, as I mentioned earlier, got a phone call to say, why was there half of a tail fin in someone's back garden just down the road? And the look of confusion and shock as this message went round the room and people realised it wasn't on their script was palpable. And afterwards, one or two people came up to me and said, you shouldn't have done that. We weren't expecting that. I said, and it is important to make sure these things don't just become tick box exercises. As I say, drop a spanner in the works. Always throw people a curveball if you can, because that's the way that you will learn. Once a crisis has actually hit, always assess what the crisis situation is. As I said earlier, the notion of putting together a holding statement is very important. That gives you time to breathe, it gives you time to think. It gives you time to assess the crisis situation. Don't speculate, keep to the facts. And this is actually the first thing that you can do as a real active operation. Everything else you can prepare for in advance. This is the first thing that cannot be done as part of rehearsal and preparation. And the first thing that I always ask myself is my organisation still in control? I can't go into this in too much depth for obvious reasons, but if there's been a serious accident and if there's a possibility of crime is being committed, it is now a crime scene and the police are therefore in charge. Obviously the air accident investigation branch I mentioned earlier, if there's been a plane crash, they will want access and they will not want their evidence tampered with. So we've now got two organisations who want to protect evidence. Is your organisation still in control? That's the first question to ask. If it's a potential crime scene, then clearly the control is in the auspices of the police, and you will normally find that the police will put someone in your war room, and therefore you can be absolutely clear that you are following the letter of the law, quite literally, and what you put out there is coordinated with what the police would wish you put out. Very, very important point, otherwise you might find yourself going to jail for contempt. Once an incident's hit, you do need to adapt and include key messages. As I say, if it's been a serious incident that could involve a crime scene, then that means making sure that you know the police. By having a meeting room for the media, you can control reasonably far as possible the information flow. And it is important, as I said earlier, to make sure that you schedule regular updates and conferences. If you update people every hour and you're giving them some colour, some meaning, they're unlikely to go wandering off site and miss the next conference, unless there's two of them, of course, some of that clever. You do need to feed the machine, otherwise it will feed itself if you go off and try and get different angles on the story. much activity, admittedly, will take place on site. But the more that you can keep people in one place, the more that you can control the message. And bizarrely, if you have a potential crime scene, it's sometimes easier to do that because the police will make sure that no one gets within a mile of the actual scene. Once you've had your crisis, instead of post-mortem, what have you actually learned? And it doesn't matter if it's an exercise or not. What you learned, what would you do differently? What went right? What went wrong? And what must we do better next time round? And one of the most important things about that post-crisis analysis is to make sure that you don't point fingers at people, because people will clam up. Remember when I started this, I said you start with a white piece of paper and a flip chart, and you just brainstorm some of the things that could go wrong. This is actually a similar process. Stand up in an unthreatening environment and say for you what went wrong. And sometimes it's something really, really fundamental. Sometimes it's something that can damage your reputation without you realising it. One of the exercises that we ran using casualties, fake casualties, and people looking after the casualties, was that we put the casualties into a room, triaged those that were seriously injured, and those that were what you categorise as walking wounded were just left there for an hour without any attention, without a drink or refreshments, bearing in mind that this was an airport and there was plenty of both of those. So you can imagine that as soon as they had the ability to do so, they would have been on their mobile phones, they'd have been on social media saying what a shambles there is, we haven't even got a drink, yet we're doing a plane crash. And again, it's not actually you as an airport's responsibility to do any of this, because it's the airline that carried them. You will make sure that you eventually that you inherit other people's crises, and that's why partnership is so important. So again, no finger pointing, and make sure that when you analyse, you give reasons why things happened, not excuses why they either didn't happen or they went wrong in your opinion. Okay, so that's the theory, and for the practice side of it, I wanted to be a little bit more open with you, and perhaps as we get towards the end, you can ask a few questions on it if you wish. The most important thing to me is what crisis communications is not about. Because if you're not careful, crisis communication becomes a crisis in itself. And if we go back to September 11th, 2001, when there was a terrorist attack on New York, Towers, one of the then current government's aides suggested that it'd be a really good day to put out some pretty bad news of the government, and very bad news, and to disguise a catastrophic incident halfway around the world. So what actually happened was that in itself became a crisis, the fact that somebody had the audacity to try and hide bad news and the cover of other news. And then the people that were trying to manage the story, disseminate the story, became the story themselves. And quite apart from being detrimental to what you're trying to achieve in the first place, it's pretty career-limiting when something like that gets splashed all over the news. And believe me, you might think that you've got really good friends in the media, and I have got good friends in the media, but you always find someone that looks for a different angle on the story. And if it means sacrificing your career to further theirs, there will be people that will take that option. The other thing when you're putting together your crisis plans, and I always used to get criticised for this phrase, is beware of bean counter. And that's a kind of slightly flippant way of saying that not everyone in your organisation will be on your wavelength. They will see what you're trying to do to protect the reputation of the organisation as being a little bit fluffy, as being something that's not that important. And actually, they'll quite often say it never happened to us, and if it does happen to us, we'll muddle through. And I've had that in organisations that I've worked at. What I have learned is it's really important to go into the budget setting process, making sure that you have an agreed and allocated amount for crisis management. And that's everything including the exercises that I mentioned to you earlier. Casualties union, getting fake casualties, that costs money. Emergency services usually won't charge you anything, it's a training exercise. But even getting members of staff in that wouldn't normally come in perhaps on a Sunday morning, there are overtime costs for that. It is a significant expenditure if you're going to do it properly. And what you have to do is balance that against the potential damage to your business and to your brand and to the brand of your partners in many cases if you do not offer a slick and professional and timely response to a crisis. Because if you don't manage the crisis, someone else will do so, and not necessarily in your best interests. So, a bit dry, a bit dull, a bit spreadsheety, which isn't really me, I have to say. But you do have to do your homework before you even start putting your crisis plans together to make sure the resources and the senior management are actually behind what you're trying to achieve. Into the unknown. Anyone know this guy? I realise it's quite a long time ago now. Donald Rumsfeld. He was the US Secretary of Defence from 2001 to 2006. And he had, I'm trying to think of something charitable to say, but he had a slightly odd demeanour, and the way in which he used English sometimes left quite a bit to be desired. And if you can just read what he says there, he kind of got himself a little bit tied up in knots. And there's been quite a debate over the last 10 to 15 years, whether or not that's good English or not. Because when you read it through, it's quite clear. There's things you know about, there's things you don't know about, and sometimes basically shit happens, you know, and that's kind of where it gets to. But it is true that we sometimes think we've got all the answers, but sometimes you haven't, and something will come up and bite you. So even though you've had that session with the flip chart right at the start to try and look at what prices there might be, there will always be something that does pop up and catches you unawares. Burns said the best laid schemes of mice and men go agley. Murphy's Law says anything that can go wrong will go wrong. Even the Chief of Staff of the Prussian Army, I bet someone get that in presentation, he said no battle plan supplies contact with the enemy. And that is very, very relevant because you can plan as much as you possibly can. It is always going to be just that. It's going to be a plan. Your plan will have to be dynamic. You'll have to adapt as events change. So it's not a tick box. It's not a tick box exercise. So one example of that, can anyone pronounce that? No, nor can I. In 2010, you may remember that there was a large volcanic eruption in Iceland. And the first I got to hear of this was about 3 o'clock in the morning when the phone rang and a voice on the end from our control office said, there's a volcano in Iceland. So you can imagine about 3 a.m. There's 7 volcanoes in Iceland. What do you expect me to do about it? Well, it's erupted. And again, it's kind of the last thing you expect to hear. But it was such a major eruption, it became clear very early on that this was going to have an impact. First of all, in terms of diverting aircraft. First wave of aircraft from the United States, continental United States, arrive in the United Kingdom about 5:30, 6 a.m. in the morning. So this is about the time that all these aircraft are in the vicinity of this volcano and I've been turned back from the US or are making long diversions around the site of the eruption, thus meaning that if they arrive in the UK, they're likely to be diverted to other airports further north because they will be short of fuel. So the first message is, well, we've got a bit of a problem. The first flight from Newark might go to Glasgow because the safety margin of fuel will be eroded otherwise. Put the phone down. Nice one to tell me. 10 minutes later, the phone rings again. We've got a slightly larger problem than that. They're now saying there's going to be a no-fly zone. We've got to start looking at scenarios for aircraft that would have been flying into mainland Europe that also won't necessarily have the margins. They're going to divert to our airport and to other airports in the UK. So at that point, you may be in a situation where you've got aeroplanes arriving at 6:30 in the morning, which is just about the time when you're trying to push your first wave of business flights out. It's a very busy time at the airport. So you go to your little black book, you start to activate people that can help with customer service, because at the time you think this is a customer service issue. You get as many people on site as possible, and you start to alert your partners in the transport industry that there might be people who want to travel forward to destinations that they weren't planning on travelling to. So for example, you might have had some London arrivals and people catching the train onwards to London. So that's okay, because that just seems like it's a bit of a glitch, no problem. About 2 hours later, as I say, these situations are dynamic. It became obvious that this was going to be not a 24-hour problem, it was going to be a problem of several days. So the challenge there at UK airports was the huge flow of passengers that were starting to roll up at airports, expecting to cross the Atlantic. And at that point, you have to make sure that you have an industry response, because it's not the fault of your airport, for heaven's sake, it's a volcano up in Iceland. And you have to make sure that everyone has a consistent message that is around the unknowns that are put in of ash, high-level ash from volcanoes and their impact on jet engines. The reason that people are so sensitive about this was that in the 1970s there was a jumbo jet crossing the Pacific, and it flew through an ash cloud, and one by one its 4 engines shut down. Not a strong position to be in when you're in the middle of the Pacific. And in the next 36 minutes, the crew did everything they could to try and restart the engines on the aircraft. And within that 36 minutes, the aircraft descended from 3,000 feet to about 2,000 feet. And they managed to restart one engine. The effect of the airflow through the engine had cleared the ash. And they managed to restart one engine, and then the second engine, and linked to an emergency airfield. So ever since then, dust clouds, volcanoes and ash have been a little bit fraught when it comes to aviation. So the interesting thing about that is after the initial crisis, nothing was flying. Once we dispersed the passengers, there was nothing to talk about. The airport was actually incredibly quiet, and even the media stayed away. And that's the point at which your stakeholders, those people that support you and know about your business, can talk on your behalf. And it's why it's important sometimes to make sure we have good relationships with trade organisations. Remember I mentioned those earlier on. So the Airport Operators Association then spoke on behalf of all UK airports, just giving regular updates as to when it was likely that the ash cloud might disperse, and when it was likely that we might be able to get aviation back on the field. So that's an example of something coming a little bit out of the unknown. I've got a little video to show you. I'm hoping it's going to show okay, and I'm going to talk through it as this runs. I haven't got a video to show you. Okay, if the video pops up. Okay, right, I'm just going to talk through this. It's not particularly good quality, but this was another little challenge that I faced about 6 o'clock one morning when you're greeted with this out the office window. What this was an aircraft, a freight aircraft, TNT parcels, that was flying from Amsterdam to Stansted Airport. Nothing to do with an airport at Birmingham, you might think. And when it got to Stansted Airport, there was fog, so it diverted to East Midlands Airport. And when it got to East Midlands Airport, it attempted to land, and did it rather badly. And when it got to East Midlands Airport, it managed to rip a set of its landing gear off on the grass, And somehow, and no one really knows how to this day, the aircraft managed to regain flight and then declare an emergency. And in such a case, what tends to happen is they make the airfield, the airport, that is the easiest for you to access, the one for the emergency. So having closed East Midlands Airport by dropping a set of landing gear on the runway, it diverts to Birmingham. And it diverted to Birmingham, and as you can see here, had a very controlled landing or controlled crash with one set of gear missing. You can see the sparks coming off that. Actually gives you quite a bit of hope, doesn't it? If you fly, you realise how safe and resilient some of these aircraft can be. And it landed on one set of gear missing. That's great from a safety point of view, fine. But my question was one of those questions that was one that people wouldn't anticipate. And it was, if it's got a set of landing gear missing, because no one knew where this landing gear was at the time, you've just flown an aircraft over the second largest city in Britain. Can you tell me where the landing gear is, please? And for a brief moment, I had this nightmare that it was in someone's back garden, or had gone through someone's roof, or worse. Now, whilst that sounds quite comical, I think you can appreciate the impact, quite literally, of a couple of tons of landing gear falling from 4,000 or 5,000 feet. At that time, it was really a sweaty palms moment until a pilot at East Midlands Airport said, well, actually, I wonder what that is on the grass. This aircraft is very unusual, actually, in that, to my knowledge, it's the only aircraft in the world to have crashed at 2 airports in the same day. Okay, so it got down, and it got on the ground, and it was safe, and lots of foam was put out, and there was no fire, and there was only a pilot and co-pilot on it, so it wasn't a case of pop the ramps and slides. Not that that aircraft had any slides or ramps. What do we do now? Because rather like the volcano scenario, we've got a terminal full of thousands of people that are expecting to catch a plane and go somewhere. We've got aircraft at 6:10 in the morning, fully boarded, waiting to push back and use the runway that these guys have so conveniently just crashed on. What do you do? Well, first of all, everyone's safe. That's the first thing to consider. But you then have to notify your airline partners that you've got a little bit of a problem in the fact that a bit of very expensive tarmac that they use is no longer usable. So you have to get everyone off the aircraft. And add the people on the aircraft back to those in the passenger lounge. Bear in mind that the dwell time in the airport passenger lounge is actually about 45 minutes typically. Every 45 minutes you're kind of filling the place to capacity. So you actually have to then stop people coming into the airport. You have to make sure that you brief the media with an initial statement of what's happening, but very quickly make sure the travel news advises people not to come to you. But otherwise you're going to have civil unrest on your hands. So that's one of the things that we did. And because there'd been no fire, there was no danger to life, this was a relatively simple exercise. But how are you ever going to get those people on their holidays? After an hour or two, you're going to get very, very impatient. You have to have a plan. You get to a situation where there are legal niceties as well. That aircraft, technically, you couldn't move it off the runway because it belonged to someone else and you might get sued if you damaged it. So we made sure that before the pilots got out of the aircraft, they signed a disclaimer. This is perfectly true, that allowed us to move it. And once the air accident investigators had been on the scene, it was quite evident that what happened at Birmingham was a result of what had happened elsewhere. They're happy for the aircraft to be moved. And that aircraft was virtually moved out of the way by a tractor to the end of the runway. And that meant that the majority of the runway could then be used for departing flights. So it meant that aircraft that didn't need the whole runway length, European and medium haul destinations, could start to use that runway and could start to clear the airport. And what we managed to do was turn that into a story that wasn't so much about a crisis, but turn that crisis into a significant win. Because because there have been very few places where you've had a major incident like that on the runway, and you've got the runway back virtually by lunchtime, the majority of it. And within 24 hours, we've got the airport fully operational again. And that really was a case of something that bolt from the blue. And you have to make sure that you are absolutely prepared for these things to happen, because if you're not, they will come and bite you. And it's never, ever the wrong thing to do to think about unusual things occurring. Crises that we avoided off the airport site was one where people were sitting around the patio, picnic table, about 5 or 6 miles south of the airport, and all of a sudden there's a big blue blur and the picnic table disintegrates. What was it? Big lump of blue ice. And what happens is, when they fill toilets on airplanes, sometimes the overflow pipes, the sort of blue fluid, is stuck in the pipe. And as aircraft descend, it then freezes when the aircraft goes up to 5 or 6 miles altitude. And as the aircraft descends, the vibration, and then as it gets warmer, loosens those blocks of ice. Very, very unusual, but it does happen. And in this instance, this block of ice came out of the sky, as I say, a bolt from the blue, demolished someone's patio table, and again, if that had been 30, 40, 50 centimetres either way, that would have killed someone. Now in that case, I mentioned earlier about burying bad news, one doesn't want to do that, but what one does want to do is make sure that a crisis doesn't become a crisis unless it absolutely has to. So on that occasion, I made sure that a member of my team went straight out to have a look at the damage, and these people got the poshest set of patio furniture and the nicest meal out that you could ever imagine. And to us, that was our way of recognising that it was serious, and they did not take it any further. Sometimes people don't want to make a big thing out of things, they just want to be recognised. And you'd be amazed sometimes what you can do to resolve a crisis by looking at it from the other person's point of view. I'm not sure, I've probably talked for far too long. But I'm happy to waffle on all day, or if you've got some questions, I'll answer some questions. It was great there's no questions, everyone's shy. Everyone's shy. No horror stories then?